Um, Good afternoon, everybody. As Peter says, I'm from IID in London, and my background is not SEA. And my purpose for being here is that I'm quite keen to learn more about SEA as a tool for planning. But the background of the climate change group at IID in general is on adaptation planning at the national and local level, and we're working on climate change mainstreaming. So my presentation today, briefly, I'm going to go over what adaptation mainstreaming is. I'm not sure how familiar everyone in the room with it is, so I'm going to introduce some of the key principles of it. I'm then going to look at SEA and adaptation mainstreaming, what the opportunities are, and possibly what some gaps are, although I'm keen to hear from the group about whether those gaps do actually exist and whether or not thinking has gone on moving ahead with them. I'm then going to look very briefly at what we're calling LAPAs, which is Local Adaptation Plans of Action. This is some work that IIED is doing on mainstreaming adaptation into development planning at the local level, and then feeding that mainstream development plans up to sectoral and national level planning processes. I don't think I'm going to have very much time to go into that, but I'd welcome discussion on that later or tomorrow. And then finally, just look at some of the key lessons. So firstly, climate change adaptation mainstreaming. There's a definition up there. It's not very different to the mainstreaming of any of the other issues, such as environment and development. But I did want to draw your attention to this particular definition, which comes from Richard Klein, which is the integration of policies and measures to address climate change into ongoing development planning and decision-making, to reduce the sensitivity of development activities, but also to build climate change resilience to development. And there are two separate parts of that definition. The first is essentially climate proofing of development plans, so looking at development planning in light of potential climate change risks and seeing if they are sustainable in the long term. But the second is looking at development planning and how, in particular, different plans and different aspects of plans and policies and programs can build resilience. And those are two connected, but actually quite different perspectives on how you do mainstreaming adaptation. And so far, the latter of those two perspectives has been rather left behind in experience on climate change adaptation mainstreaming to date. The rationale for mainstreaming climate change adaptation is that the climate change debate has been rather further behind from other environment and development planning so far. It has taken a projectised approach to implementation and delivery, and there's now a shift towards much more integrated climate change and development planning, but not a lot of action on moving that agenda ahead. So to move to those two different perspectives on climate change mainstreaming, adaptation mainstreaming, most work has taken a technology-based approach to mainstreaming climate change adaptation. So as I said, the purpose of that is to address climate change adaptation risks in development planning to climate-proof development policies, programmes and plans. The focus then is on the potential climate change impacts on development and choosing specific technologies that will be suitable for future climate change conditions. The information and the approach that you need in risk assessment for that is climate change screening. You need climate change impacts analysis, and you need a good understanding of climate change trends and future climate change projections and scenarios. A lot of the ecosystems-based approaches to climate change mainstreaming are taking this approach. The scale for planning is national and sectoral level mainstreaming, so trying to climate-proof national sector-level plans. An example of that would be if you're looking at policies and plans in place for irrigation systems or agricultural systems in light of climate change trends that suggest increased drought in the future. You would then improve your irrigation systems in response to that increasing drought, strengthening them, expanding them. The second approach to climate change adaptation mainstreaming is a development-based approach. It looks at how development policies, plans and processes can be used to build resilience for vulnerable people in relation and ecosystems in relation to climate change impacts, but also other risks as well. The focus, instead of on climate change impacts, is on the drivers of vulnerability to climate stresses, but also to other stresses. So in terms of information, climate change is one aspect, but it also pays equal attention to a number of other drivers of vulnerability as well. It requires a disaggregated vulnerability analysis to understand not a broad-based approach to climate change risk, but to understand who's most vulnerable to that risk, why they're most vulnerable, where they are, and what the factors are that generate a disaggregated vulnerability. So the scale is local subnational planning. And again, an example, looking at the irrigation system, you wouldn't think, do we need a stronger irrigation system? You would think, why is this irrigation system not working in a particular area? Do people have access to it? Why don't they have access to it? How can we improve their access to that? Looking at challenges for mainstreaming climate change adaptation so far, mainstreaming is happening. It's happening in donor interventions. A lot of donors are screening their portfolios for climate change risks, taking a climate-proofing approach. National plans have started to integrate climate change considerations. But one of the big challenges we're facing is trying to match international funding requirements, political preferences, and domestic vulnerability needs. So at the international level, climate change funding is intended to be spent on climate change. When you try and mainstream climate change into development planning, the question of what element of that plan is climate change and can be funded through climate change finance versus what element is development is very difficult to calculate. And it creates incentives for national planners and sectoral planners to select to climate-proof interventions where you can actually prove a climate change impact, or select areas where you can see that climate change impacts are happening. And that creates an incentive to move away from real vulnerability needs at the domestic and lower levels. A second challenge is integrating upstream climate change planning with downstream climate change vulnerability. Now, again, in the first place, these can be two quite different things. So at the national and sectoral level, you're looking at climate proofing of existing policies and plans. At the local level, vulnerability is not sector specific. Local level vulnerability plans are coming into village level and district level planning systems that don't fall neatly under sector level planning structures. And in particular, there's a real need for evidence-based policy making and monitoring and evaluation systems that don't exist at the moment for climate change adaptation in general, so that's climate change projects, but particularly for mainstreamed climate change adaptation. In terms of generating evidence and monitoring and evaluation for climate change mainstreaming, you need to look at whether climate change information is being taken into account in policies, plans, practices. But you also need to look at whether those plans are being delivered and whether that delivery is building adaptive capacity. So the second aspect of mainstreaming climate change planning. And that's not really happening, and it's something at IIED that we're working on at the moment. A final challenge is multi-stakeholder participation. Now, it's agreed in the text of the UNFCCC, the convention text, that to understand vulnerability, we need to include local people in our climate change adaptation planning. However, if we take a technology-based approach to climate change mainstreaming, the information that we use and that we need and that we focus on is climate change impact assessment. It's a very technology-driven approach to understanding climate change risk, which necessarily then excludes the vulnerable people on the ground who don't have access to that information. Most of the mainstreaming processes that we've seen so far on climate change use local community representatives in consultation exercises, essentially to verify what's already been decided on what appropriate climate change plans would be. It's not really engaging them, allowing them to define their own climate change risks, why they perceive these risks to be there, why they're vulnerable to those risks, and what they think needs to be done to the development planning systems at the local level that would allow them access to the services, to the structures that they need to adapt. How much time have I got?
Oh, about 5 minutes.
Okay. So all of these challenges are something that SEA practitioners are familiar with, and I'm quite keen to hear from my fellow panellists whether addressing these challenges is coming out of SEA practices, how that's already being done. So in terms of using SEAs for mainstreaming climate change adaptation, the SEA task team has developed guidelines for this already. There are several case studies emerging of using SEAs for climate change adaptation mainstreaming. And again, I'm not incredibly familiar with these, but I've had a look at them and a brief look at some of the case studies that are coming up. In particular, some of the planning that's going on in Orissa in India at the moment for climate change mainstreaming using SEA as a tool. And there are many valuable applications of SEAs as tools for climate change adaptation mainstreaming. In particular for climate proofing, SEAs are very good at integrating a risk and doing risk assessments on existing policies, plans, processes. These tools are starting to bring in climate change information, scenario planning where it exists, applying it to development plans, and so it is meeting that first half of the climate change adaptation mainstreaming agenda. SEAs have been quite good so far at taking an integrated and country-driven approach to national and sectoral level planning. Increasingly, SEAs are a tool that developing countries are becoming familiar with, although a lot more could be done on that front. Is it really worth trying to introduce new tools for climate change risk screening and proofing at the national and sector level, or should we go with tools that are already being pushed, that developing country governments are getting familiar with, that they can understand, that they can use? There's real value there in trying to build on what we know rather than creating new systems. Multi-stakeholder participation is something that strategic environmental assessments already emphasise, and again, that's essential for climate change adaptation planning. However, the type of multi-stakeholder participation that seems to have been used so far in SEAs, and again, I'm sure my colleagues in the room can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but seems to be engaging sectoral level planners, national level planners, NGOs, and consultants and experts, private sector, but not so much on the local level participation that's needed for detailed disaggregated vulnerability analyses. So I've mentioned some of these already, but some potential gaps and challenges for SEAs as a tool for adaptation planning. So this is something that was mentioned this morning in one of the earlier sessions. Are the embedded assumptions that SEA looks at impacts of policies, plans and programmes on a static environment rather than a non-static environment on the effectiveness of policies, programmes, plans for building adaptive capacity? Is that an assumption that's being carried over to climate change adaptation mainstreaming, or is that something that's already being addressed by the SEA community? Does it really matter? Is it not something that's very embedded? Secondly, does a focus on environmental impact drive a corresponding focus on impacts assessments, on climate change risk assessments for adaptation mainstreaming, rather than the second part of the equation, a vulnerability assessment? So are SEAs useful for one part of the mainstreaming process, but perhaps less useful for trying to address local level vulnerability and trying to make sure mainstream's plans are actually delivered? If there's a role for SEAs in delivering mainstream's plans, what is that? How has it been used before? Finally, the focus of SEAs is on national and sector level planning. Again, are they applicable for the disaggregated local level vulnerability analysis and the delivery of the benefits to the most vulnerable people? I'm just going to spend 1 minute going through the work that we're doing in Nepal at the moment on local level adaptation planning, and I don't have much time to go over this, but I would welcome discussion afterwards on it. We're looking at LAPAs, so local adaptation plans of action, as a way of delivering national adaptation plans. The point of this programme is to try and develop some sort of institutional mechanism for local level communities and planners to reach up and draw down the national and international finance and institutional support that's coming in for climate change adaptation. So we're identifying institutions and mechanisms to mainstream adaptation into development planning processes at the local level, so that's village level, district level planning, and then we're trying to enable this reach up, draw down function to enable access of those plans to the resources that they need. We're looking at a portfolio of designs for different mechanisms and interventions. So we're looking at frameworks for integrated planning. We've just come out of a 9-month piloting phase looking at different types of frameworks at the local level. We're looking at frameworks for financing those plans, which are national level financing frameworks, working through sector level bodies, possibly setting up new institutional systems. And finally, we're developing a monitoring and evaluation framework for bottom-up mainstreaming. This framework is looking at monitoring and evaluating whether mainstreaming is taking place, but is also placing a huge emphasis on whether mainstream's plans are being delivered and whether that delivery is making a difference to adaptive capacity. So it's trying to move beyond this emphasis of mainstreaming on climate change risk, climate change proofing, towards mainstreaming as a vehicle for building adaptive capacity at the local level. So I'll end with this slide, which is just a few questions to the group to try and stimulate some discussion, and I hope that we'll hear some of this from my fellow panellists. Does climate change adaptation present novel challenges, or is this something that's been faced before? Are these challenges particularly difficult for climate change because it has been framed so stringently as a technical, science-based risk? What experiences of SEA relate to this messy meso challenge? So the challenge of trying to relate local level adaptation planning with high level governance structures through which climate change resources are flowing through, and through which the emphasis of mainstreaming on national and sectoral level planning occurs. And finally, how can the challenges presented by mainstreaming climate change adaptation inform an approach to using SEAs for adaptation, mainstreaming and delivery? We've got guidelines for SEAs on mainstreaming adaptation. How can we move those forward to try and address some of these challenges?